Hey everyone, Noam here. Before we jump in, I want to acknowledge the moment we're in. As of this release, March 3rd, 2026, Israel and the United States are now in direct conflict with Iran. History is unfolding in real time. We're working on episodes that will help make sense of what's happening with the depth and the context that you expect from us. But today, we are releasing the final installment in our 5-part series on Jewish history and Israel's place within it. We recorded this before the current war began, and we're sharing the final episode now. If this series has traced how the Jewish people understood land, power, sovereignty, exile, and return, then what's happening right now is not outside that story at all. It's part of the long arc we've been exploring. So eventually, we'll surely need to add a 6th episode. But today we complete the series. And then we turn to the present. Yalla, let's do this. Hey, I'm Noam Weissman, and this is Unpacking Israeli History, the podcast that takes a deep dive into some of the most intense, historically fascinating, and often misunderstood events and stories linked to Israeli history. This episode of Unpacking Israeli History is generously sponsored by Deborah and Avi Nader and Jody and Ari Storch. To sponsor an episode of Unpacking Israeli History, or just to say what's up, be in touch at Noam at Unpacked Media. Before we start, as always, check us out on Instagram, on TikTok, on YouTube, all the places. Just search Unpacking Israeli History and hit the follow or subscribe button. Okay, yalla, let's do this.
אנו מכריזים בזאת על הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל. היא מדינת ישראל.
We, the people of Israel, are prepared and anxious to meet the representatives of our neighbors without any preconditions.
There are people in Israel and elsewhere say it's impossible to make peace between the Arabs and Israel or the Jewish people. I think they are wrong.
Welcome to the final installment in our 5-part series of the Jewish people's ancient relationship to the land of Israel. If you haven't listened to episodes 1 to 4, come on. That's like tuning into Act 5 of Romeo and Juliet. I mean, you do you. But seriously, this makes the most sense if you listen from the beginning. We last left off at the tail end of 1973 as Israelis confronted the enormity of the failures that led to the Yom Kippur War. If 1967 prompted national celebration, 1973 kicked off a series of national reckonings about the country's identity. Did Israelis really want to be socialists or capitalists? Farmers or high-tech moguls? Western or European? And what was more important, being Jewish or being democratic? For that matter, what did being a Jewish state even mean? Some of these questions still threaten to tear the state apart. Up till now, we've stayed firmly in the realm of history. But by the end of this episode, we'll have one foot in the present, the other hovering towards the future. But we have a lot of ground to cover before then, beginning with the Revolution of 1977. Chapter 1, Ladies and Gentlemen, Revolution. On May 17, 1977, the entire country sat glued to the nightly broadcast to hear the results of the latest election. Squinting into the camera, broadcaster Chaim Yavin made an announcement that would immediately enter the national lexicon. Gvirotai v'rabotai, mahapach. Ladies and gentlemen, revolution. An entire country gasped. The party of Ben-Gurion, of Golda Meir, of kibbutzim, labor unions, and quote-unquote new Jews, which had ruled Israel since before there was an Israel, was no longer in charge. Labor was out. Likud was in. Ben-Gurion didn't live to see the victory of the man he'd labeled, and this is a real quote, a Hitlerist, and refused to call by name during Knesset meetings. Seriously, love the petty energy. Love it. Ben-Gurion may have been gone, but the old guard of Israeli politics was filling his shoes just fine. The former general secretary of Israel's labor union declared on television that, quote, if this is the will of the people, we have to replace the people. And he didn't mean the people of the kibbutzim and the labor unions. He meant the other people. You know, people in development towns who spoke Judeo-Arabic or French or Hakatia at home. You've never heard of Hakatia. Admit it, you've never heard of it. Anyway, but those people, maybe you have heard of it. The people who went to synagogue regularly, maybe you heard of them. Who were often kept out for being too, not Ashkenazi. Israel's mostly Mizrahi, Middle East or North African underclass was tired of being neglected, dismissed, and overlooked. And they weren't the only ones to mobilize for the first candidate who had made them feel seen. The kibbutz generation was aging. Zionist idealism was rusting from corruption. Young people were sick of Marxist lectures on collectivism. Then came the Yom Kippur War, which shattered the aura of competence. When Menachem Begin took the helm, he was an unwelcome anomaly to the ruling elite. He wore a three-piece suit in July, addressed the Knesset like a courtroom, invoked biblical prophets, unlike the early Zionists. Begin didn't shy away from the Jewish past. He wasn't ashamed of Jewish piety. He wasn't embarrassed by the Holocaust, which had claimed his family. To him, the diaspora symbolized continuity, not weakness. And he was the first Israeli leader to treat Jews from Muslim lands as equals. In an iconic 1981 speech, he tells the story of two Irgun members slated for execution by the British. Rather than give the enemy the satisfaction of a public hanging, the two smuggle a grenade into their jail cell, pull the pin, and lie down on top of it, together. Feinstein was from a European background. What's it called? Ashkenazi. Moshe Barzani was Sephardic, from Iraq. Ashkenazi, Iraqi, Jews, brothers, warriors. Do you hear Begin's emotion? The crowd going wild? For the first time, someone in power was acknowledging Israel's Mizrahim, recognizing their value, their service, their belonging. So when Begin called them Achim, brothers, the Mizrahi public believed him, especially when he followed through, expanding public housing, raising welfare benefits, and appointing Mizrahi ministers to key posts. But perhaps more surprising than the appointment of Mizrahi ministers was his approach to the opposition. He could have used his electoral victory to take revenge on the people who had spent decades calling him a fascist. Instead, he gathered his new ministers and top civil servants and declared, "There will be no purges. We are all servants of the state." Begin was no stranger to leadership. From 1943 to 1948, before the state of Israel was officially a state, he commanded the Irgun, the hardline underground militia that had broken away from the Haganah over, let's say, differences of opinion on military strategy. Where the Haganah focused on havlaga, meaning restraint, the Irgun was not afraid to use force. Where the Haganah cautioned against provocations, the Irgun believed in deterrence, aka preemptive attacks, reprisal raids, and an unflinching approach to power. It was under Begin's leadership that the Irgun bombed the British headquarters at the King David Hotel in 1946. The operation horrified much of the Yishuv, not to mention Jews living abroad who saw Begin as a reckless extremist. So when Begin won the election, everyone expected more of the same. After all, he had spent decades in the opposition, warning against territorial compromises and accusing labor leaders of weakness and naivete. But 5 months into his tenure as prime minister, Begin sent the country reeling. The hawk, the extremist, the so-called fascist, and Nazi and terrorist did something unthinkable, something that no other Israeli leader had done. He invited Egyptian President Anwar Sadat to Jerusalem. Yes, the leader of Israel's most formidable rival, its enemy number one. Imagine Bibi inviting Iran's Ayatollah Khomeini over for tea and cookies, and you have a more or less accurate picture of just how insane this was. Just a couple decades before his visit to Israel, Sadat had written a fawning letter to Hitler. Yeah, that Hitler, who had been dead for 8 years. Quote, "Dear Hitler, I salute you from the depths of my heart. You have become an eternal leader of Germany, and no one ought to be surprised if you will rise to power again, or if the world will see another great Hitler." I mean, yikes. But now, it was November of 1977, and Anwar Sadat was standing before the Knesset, Israel's parliament in Jerusalem. 2 years later, the world watched in awe and some confusion as the former leader of the Irgun, right, that, right-wing militia, and the architect of the Yom Kippur War, referring to Sadat, signed a peace deal that has not wavered in the decades since. I want to be clear. It takes two sides to make peace. And I want to be equally clear. You don't make peace with your friends. You make peace with your enemies. Begin's invitation didn't come out of nowhere. It was a response to Sadat's public indication that he was ready to talk. Both leaders showed incredible and unexpected courage. But where Begin was celebrated by most of the Israeli public, Sadat's bravery earned him an execution at the hands of Egyptian. But where Begin was celebrated by most of the Israeli public, Sadat's bravery earned him an execution at the hands of Egyptian Islamic Jihad. In comparison, Israel's sacrifice was, far less extreme. In order to achieve peace, Israel would return the entire Sinai Peninsula, a territory 3 times larger than the state itself. This was a big deal. It meant dismantling army bases, destroying settlements, and uprooting roughly 7,000 Israeli citizens who lived there, who moved there, who made their life there. As the IDF dismantled the Sinai's 18 settlements, television cameras caught a moment that summed up the paradox. An Israeli officer weeping, draped in the national flag as he followed orders to demolish a house. Was this victory or surrender? Was withdrawal the ultimate expression of Zionism or its betrayal? Begin had a very clear answer. From the Knesset stage, he quoted the biblical book of Devarim, or Deuteronomy. I'll say the Hebrew first. Ha'idoti v'chem hayom et hashamayim v'et haaretz ha'chayim v'hamavet natati lefanecha ha'bracha v'haklala u'v'charta b'chayim. English. I have set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. Therefore, choose life. His critics called him a hypocrite. His admirers called him a prophet. But in Israel, choosing life often comes with a death toll. And the final chapter of Begin's tenure was spattered with blood. Israel's southern border was quiet. Its northern border, however, was a mess. The Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO, was doing its best to, quote, liberate Palestine by launching rockets and cross-border raids into Israel from their base in southern Lebanon. Let me make that more concrete. I'm about to tell you a truly awful story, so if you're not in the mood, please skip the next 20 seconds. In 1979, a Druze teenager named Samir Kuntar and 3 comrades from the Palestine Liberation Front left Lebanon in a rubber boat bound for the Israeli coast, intending to kidnap Israelis. Instead of abducting, however, Kuntar killed a young father in front of his 4-year-old daughter, then bashed the little girl's head in. Kuntar was only 16, a child, murdering a child. This was an unusually brutal raid, but it was hardly an outlier. The PLO and related groups had infiltrated Israel from South Lebanon hundreds of times, to say nothing of the rockets they lobbed or the attacks they carried out outside of the region. In fact, it was an attack on the Israeli ambassador to England, Shlomo Argov, in June of 1982 that convinced Begin that enough was enough. Less than 72 hours after Argov took a gunshot to the head, Israeli tanks were rolling into southern Lebanon. But to many Israelis, the attempted hit on Argov was merely a pretext for the invasion. They pointed out that Argov's would-be assassins, the Abu Nidal organization, had split from the PLO, which they believed wasn't extreme enough. No one in Israel liked either group, but many didn't understand why their country would target the PLO when Abu Nidal had targeted Argov. Plus, they pointed out, the U.S. had sort of brokered a ceasefire between Israel and the PLO back in the summer of 1981. True, it was unofficial with ambiguous terms, but the border had been relatively quiet. But Begin was done with this so-called ceasefire and with the UN forces on the border who had done very little to enforce it. You know what they say, if you want something done well, you got to do it yourself. But this invasion was not done well, and the gamble would ultimately end Begin's career. Operation Peace for the Galilee, aka the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, 2 different names, was supposed to be a limited operation to establish a buffer zone. The IDF accomplished this easily and then kept going. Israel's wars had always been short and fast, clear-cut battles for survival, not this time. Think of 48. Think of 56. Think of 67. Think of 73. This mission had been accomplished. But Israeli soldiers were still dying in Lebanon. Hundreds, if not thousands, of Palestinians had been massacred by a Christian militia, while the IDF absorbed the blame. Enraged, hundreds of thousands of Israelis took to the streets. And we made a whole episode on this. This is the story of Sabra and Shatila, which you should absolutely check out. But in that blur of pain, Begin's sense of purpose dimmed, and he began to withdraw. By 1983, he stepped down with a tragic parting line. I'll say it in Hebrew. Eineni yachol od. Literally, I can't anymore. I can't. The IDF remained in South Lebanon for the next 18 years. Chapter 2. Changes. Imagine a world in which Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton both served as president, taking turns leading the country each year. Sounds like chaos, lunacy. Sounds like Israel in the 1980s. After Begin resigned in 1983, Yitzhak Shamir stepped in temporarily. Like Begin, Shamir had fought in the Irgun during the British Mandate. Unlike Begin, he then split off to join a more extreme group, Lehi, or Lochamei Cherut Yisrael, Fighters for the Freedom of Israel. It's a complicated, maybe that's a euphemism, and fascinating, and it is, group, and really worth a deep dive. For now, let's just say that they were not down with restraint. Their methods could be shocking, including targeted assassinations and questionable alliances. After the group disbanded, Shamir spent the 50s and early 60s in the Mossad, coordinating secret missions behind enemy lines. And though his party did not win the most seats in the elections of 1984, he formed a unity government with a left-leaning party predicated on a power-sharing agreement. What this means practically is that he and Shimon Peres, an old-school labor Zionist type, agreed to share the job of prime minister 2 years at a time. While Shamir served as prime minister, Peres served as foreign minister, and vice versa. Israeli politics are wild. And so is Israeli society, which spent the 80s and 90s hovering between the two poles of left and right. Now, I'm generalizing here when I say that, broadly speaking, on the right were the religious Zionists who had gained prominence after the Six-Day War. The Gush Emunim, or Bloc of the Faithful movement, believed that settling the biblical heartland wasn't a policy choice, but a sacred obligation. To many of them, the Sinai evacuation of 1982 was heresy, and they were determined to stop it from repeating in the sacred regions of Judea and Samaria, aka the West Bank. By the way, stay tuned for upcoming episodes about the history of religious Zionism. Incredibly interesting stuff, like super duper interesting. Gush Emunim was led by Hanan Parat, a paratrooper turned religious leader who was among the first to reestablish Israeli communities in the West Bank. Parat was convinced that history had tapped him on the shoulder. He once said, quote, "We are writing the next chapter of the Bible." I actually like that line a lot. It's a really compelling line. The religious Zionist worldview taught that the people of Israel were indivisible from the land of Israel. Ceding Israeli territory wasn't diplomacy, but amputation. On the other end of the spectrum was the blossoming peace movement. Peace Now, aka Shalom Achshav, was co-founded by Yuli Tamir, the daughter of Holocaust survivors. Both Parat and Tamir were staunch Zionists, but their Zionism expressed itself in opposing ways. Where Parat saw divine promise in settling the biblical heartland, Tamir believed that holding on to it was a sign of moral rot. For her, Zionism's greatest test wasn't how much land Israel could reclaim, but how much of its democratic soul it could preserve. She insisted that the real patriotism of her generation was not conquering more territory, but choosing a future in which Israelis and Palestinians would no longer live in perpetual war. The brilliant writer Amos Oz described this new split not as right versus wrong, but as a tragedy between right and right. Israelis, he wrote, had become, quote, a people fated to choose between their history and their conscience, their survival and their soul. If Gush Emunim and Shalom Achshav represented the ends of the spectrum, most Israelis found themselves somewhere in the middle. The polls of the mid-'80s showed that the Israeli public was neither debating a two-state solution nor rolling out the red carpet for the Messiah's imminent arrival. Peace Now and Gush Emunim weren't mainstream positions, but rival vanguards, each trying to steer a country that was still standing in the middle of the road. The two camps were hardly the only example of Israel's increasing diversity. By the early 90s, the state founded by socialist pioneers was now crawling with free market entrepreneurs. The secular Sabra elite, meanwhile, found themselves sharing the stage, sometimes unwillingly, with Mizrahi activists, religious Zionists, Russian immigrants, and a younger generation that didn't remember a world without the state. In Beersheva and Netanya, children of Moroccan and Iraqi immigrants were going to universities and elite army units. In Tel Aviv, the kibbutz was fading. People were buying condos, opening businesses, and discovering the lure of capitalism. Kibbutz Mishmar HaEmek even stopped celebrating Stalin's birthday. By the way, that's not a joke. They really did that for decades. In short, the unifying myth of one people, one destiny was fraying. Not out of apathy, but out of abundance. The founding generation had been bound by a shared understanding of sacrifice. But when the fault lines underneath the surface began to widen, what had once been a conversation began to sound like cacophony. In the face of these existential growing pains, Israel did what any young democracy with barely 5 million people would do. It absorbed another 1 million immigrants from a vastly different culture. That was sarcasm, by the way. Sorry. That's the Jewish part of me. Sorry. Between 1989 and 1999, Israel's population grew by over 20%, as nearly 1 million Jews from the former Soviet Union took advantage of their newfound freedom to emigrate. Doctors, engineers, violinists, chess players, mathematicians, and political dissidents flooded the country, fluent in Russian, Chekhov, and skepticism. Meanwhile, tens of thousands of Ethiopian Jews arrived to the promised land at last, many of them forced to bury their loved ones en route. Each wave of immigrants added a new layer to the Israeli mosaic, sparking new arguments about who exactly, quote, the people of Israel were. Yossi Klein Halevi summed it all up in a perfect quote. Yossi's got great quotes. Here's what he said. The wonder of Israel is that it works. Barely. That chaos was on full display in the 90s as Israelis debated major pillars of law and daily life on the fly. Putting aside conflict, borders, and security, Israelis argued about the role of religion in public life, whether Hebrew should absorb Arabic slang, even whether hummus could be patented. This was a tangled, contradictory democracy. Secular liberals relied on the army units filled with religious Zionists. Settlers in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, depended on the taxes of leftist Tel Avivians. Russian engineers built the software that kept everyone's phones working, even as they found themselves pigeonholed and marginalized. In Russia, they had been Zids, Jews. By the way, random story. When I was in high school, the term Zids, I once tried to make a club in my school called Yid of the Week. And my head of school did not allow me to do it because she said that the term Yid had a connotation of anti-Semitism. And I didn't really know what she was talking about. But it comes from here, the Zids, the Yids. So maybe she was right all along. Anyway, in the country of the Jews, however, many Israelis insisted that decades of state anti-Semitism and intermarriage had diluted their Jewish identity beyond recognition. Meanwhile, while all this is happening, 1.5 million Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank remained under Israeli military control, growing tenser by the year. No one had planned for 2 decades of military occupation. By 1987, the Palestinians' resentment and frustration erupted into the grassroots uprising we call the First Intifada, as Palestinians used every means at their disposal to, quote, shake off, that's what Intifada means, the Israeli military occupation. Some of those means were peaceful, civil disobedience and strikes, but the unending stones and the slingshots and the stabbings and the firebombs left the country on edge. The defining image of the First Intifada beamed into countless living rooms during the nightly broadcast was a young Palestinian hurling a rock at an Israeli tank. For much of the world, this one image immediately shifted the small, scrappy Jewish state from its erstwhile position as David to a profoundly oppressive Goliath. Meanwhile, in Israel, each faction read the moment through its own moral lens. And that's a pretty human tendency. It doesn't make it right or wrong, but it's a human tendency, to be fair. To Hanan Porat and Gush Amunim, the First Intifada was proof that retreating from the West Bank would only invite greater danger. But to Yuli Tamir and Shalom Achshav, it was a moral reckoning, the unavoidable cost of ruling in other people. Both turned out to be right. By 1993, both Israelis and Palestinians had had enough of the bloodshed. Secretly, representatives from both sides met neutral ground to hammer out an end to the violence. The Oslo Accords hinged on a single premise, issued in the wake of the Six-Day War of 1967. UN Security Council Resolution 242, as well as the 1978 Camp David Agreement with Egypt, stipulated that if Israel withdrew from territory it had gained during the Six-Day War, then Palestinians could finally renounce violence and rule themselves. Easy peasy. So on September 13th, 1993, I remember this vividly, two leaders who had spent their lives fighting each other shook hands on the White House lawn as Bill Clinton beamed in the background. I still see that smile. Oh, what a big smile that was. For a brief and shining moment, many Israelis allowed themselves to imagine a world without conflict. It didn't last. Chapter 3, Startup Nation. The prospect of peace was thrilling, and not just because it meant parents, both Israeli and Palestinian, would no longer have to worry about their children dying. Peace also meant prosperity, a prosperity that Israel desperately needed. By the mid-1980s, the socialist dream had given way to an economic nightmare. Inflation hit 400%. Kibbutzim were drowning in debt. Young people resigned themselves to living in their childhood bedrooms or cramped rentals with 3 roommates for the rest of their lives. Something had to give. In 1985, the year I was born, Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Shamir's unity government launched the Economic Stabilization Plan, a kind of emergency surgery. Price freezes, subsidy cuts, wage controls, and a de facto truce between labor and business. It was painful, but it worked. Inflation dropped from triple digits to single digits in under 2 years. The ideal of the agrarian pioneer, the new Jew, who worked the land, had been replaced by the budding entrepreneur. Meanwhile, the Histadrut, the labor union that had effectively run the country since before it was a country, was in freefall. Cooperative grocery stores closed. Hospitals, banks, and shipping companies went private. Even kibbutzim, once built on collective ownership and equal wages, restructured around private salaries, personal bank accounts, and individual home ownership. Privatization marked Israel's ideological pivot, from a socialist labor Zionist economy built on collectivism and state planning to a market-driven system that rewarded individual initiative, competition, and capital. A generation raised on the idea that everyone's labor was sacred was now discovering that some labor paid better than others. This wasn't just about turning a profit. It was also about survival. Maybe you've heard the old Jewish joke. Why did the Jews wander in the desert for 40 years? Because it took them long to find the only place in the Middle East with no oil. Hey! But what the Jewish state lacked in natural resources, it made up in guilt. No, I'm kidding. It made up for in human capital and innovation. Israel's military became a training ground for a new kind of Zionist. The coder soldier, 20-year-olds with bulky computers wrote algorithms that would later run the global internet. The military was no longer just defending the country, but incubating its economy. By the early 2000s, foreign VC money was pouring in. Startups with ridiculous names, Checkpoint, Waze, ICQ, Mobileye, became the new national symbols. Ingenuity, after all, had always been Zionism's unofficial religion. The chutzpah, once reserved for defying empires, was now powering the chase for the next IPO. As Yossi Klein Halevi puts it, Zionism has always been about transformation of land, of people, of destiny. Technology is simply the next frontier. Many of Israel's elder statesmen and women were no longer around to see the country's turn to unabashed capitalism. Maybe they would have seen this new chapter as heresy, an affront to the socialist values that had really built the country. Ben-Gurion might have been horrified to see that instead of oranges and drip irrigation, Israelis were now exporting flash drives, self-driving technology, cybersecurity solutions, and biomedical products. But I'd like to think he would have been amazed by his people's continued creativity and innovation. After all, this was the guy who decided to pursue a nuclear weapon when the country couldn't even produce radios. Yeah, Israel was no longer socialist. But maybe the real backbone of Zionism wasn't anything to do with socialism, but it was the chutzpah to pursue what but seemed impossible. Still, Israel's socialist old guard would have been horrified by the ever-widening inequality between the haves and the have-nots. In the early days of the state, everyone was poor. Sure, some were more poor than others, particularly the penniless immigrants who had been banished to the country's periphery. But Israel's newfound prosperity wasn't closing that gap, but expanding it. The glitter of Tel Aviv seemed entirely removed from the sirens and stagnation in the border towns of Sderot or Ofakim. The philosopher Micha Goodman once warned that Zionism's biggest danger wasn't external threat, but internal complacency. When survival becomes guaranteed, purpose becomes negotiable. That's what he said. But even as they pursued this newfound cosmopolitanism, Israelis were about to learn, yet again, that survival was not guaranteed. The Second Intifada ripped through Israel like a wildfire that could not be contained. For 5 years, and I was there for a few of those years, every parting felt momentous, potentially final. Every outing carried risk. Getting a coffee, taking the bus, going to the movies, all dangled a potential existential price tag. Yeah, I was in Israel at the time, and I vividly remember my parents forbidding me and my older brother to enter any establishment without an armed guard. That's a crazy way to live. The worst days were the ones with multiple attacks. A suicide bomb on a commuter bus in the morning, a shooting at a checkpoint in the afternoon, another bomb that night. The army re-entered West Bank towns hunting terrorists, but often encountering civilians. Concrete barriers cut Israelis off from Palestinians and cut Palestinians off from each other. Schools, jobs, and holy sites. Checkpoints multiplied. Engineers hastily paved new Israeli-only roads. Too many people had been murdered by snipers or stone throwers hiding along the highway leading into the West Bank. By the time the horror ended, more than 4,000 people were dead. Over 1,000 Israelis and roughly 3,000 Palestinians. But something else had died too. The trust required to believe in peace. And so in the summer of 2005, when Prime Minister Ariel Sharon uprooted the around 9,000 Jews who lived in Gaza, in the areas known as Gush Katif, he didn't ask for concessions in return. This wasn't a land for peace deal. This wasn't a two-part deal. It was something else. It's called a unilateral withdrawal, meaning from one side. Just Israel. They didn't really want to pay attention to what Palestinians were doing there. A signal that Gaza would no longer be Israel's problem. The move was wildly controversial and deeply traumatic. When Hamas took power in 2006, fully seizing control of the Strip in 2007, the naysayers took no pleasure in saying, "I told you so." Slowly, Israelis grew used to a horrifying status quo. The periphery towns were bombarded constantly by crude rockets launched from the Gaza Strip. Every year or two, a rocket would hit the state's economic center, and Israel would respond with a volley of airstrikes until the other side cried uncle. Lather, rinse, repeat. By the 2020s, this status quo was almost unremarkable, even to the Israelis living on the Gaza border. Constant rockets, a war every other year. That was just life in the Holy Land, small potatoes compared to the internal divisions that threatened to tear Israel apart. Chapter 4, The Age of Fragmentation. By the early 2020s, the old Zionist consensus, the fragile glue that held together socialists, the Jewish settlers in the West Bank, secularists, and soldiers had begun to crack. Israel was richer, stronger, and more globally admired than ever before. Without a significant existential threat to unite them, Israelis fragmented. And remember, they had the Abraham Accords. And they weren't just arguing about the future, but also about the past. Was Israel a democratic state for Jews, or a Jewish state that wore the clothes of democracy? Did the founders envision a constitution, a separation of powers, a rabbinate with national authority? These questions weren't new, but for the first time, Israelis had the space to consider them. And the debates weren't pretty. They were not pretty. Especially once the government passed the 2018 nation-state law, which codified Israel as, quote, the nation-state of the Jewish people. For many, this was an uncontroversial and long overdue affirmation of Zionism's core truth. But for others, including Arabs, Druze, and other minorities, not to mention liberal diaspora Jews, it felt like an unnecessary retreat from the egalitarian promise of the Declaration of Independence, which declared, quote, the state of Israel will maintain complete equality of social and political rights for all its citizens without distinction of religion, race, or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. The emotional temperature rose with each legislative session. This was no mere ideological dispute, but a full-on culture war, and everyone was taking sides. Everything was up for debate. Why should Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox as they're called in English, be exempt from military or national service? Why didn't Israel have a constitution? How could the Supreme Court claim legitimacy when its justices all represented the increasingly out-of-touch minority of a liberal secular elite? Meanwhile, the government kept falling apart. Israelis grew exhausted and cynical from trudging to the polls 5 times in 4 years. The country's political parties were so polarized that it became impossible to build a coalition. And so, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who at the time of this recording has led the state for nearly 1/4 of its existence, which is insane. Just that number is insane. It's wild. 25%. That's a quarter. He did something that would have been absolutely unthinkable just 5 or 10 years before. He invited the far right into the Knesset. People who were, this is not opinion, who were absolutely considered fringe figures, who were universally dismissed as being fringe. They were now in positions of power. Israel's new finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, had once defended Israeli developers who refused to sell homes to Arab Israelis, claiming, quote, someone who wants to protect the Jewish people and oppose mixed marriages is not a racist. Someone who wants to let Jews live a Jewish life without non-Jews is not a racist. A year later, in 2016, he made international headlines once more for suggesting that Israeli maternity wards should be segregating, tweeting, "It's natural that my wife wouldn't want to lie down in a bed next to a woman who just gave birth to a baby who might want to murder her baby 20 years from now. Arabs are my enemies, and that's why I don't enjoy being next to them." Meanwhile, the new National Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, now in charge of the Israeli police, had been charged 53 separate times by the very force he now led. Up until 2019, a portrait of Baruch Goldstein hung in his living room. Goldstein is infamous for shooting 29 unarmed Palestinians as they prayed in the mosque adjacent to Marat HaMachpelah, the Cave of the Patriarchs, where our shared Abrahamic ancestors are said to be buried. Not shooting, killing. Not a guy whose portrait I'd want on my wall personally. Liberal Israelis and diaspora Jews despaired. But the fight was only beginning. In January of 2023, the most right-wing coalition in Israel's history introduced sweeping legislation to limit the powers of the Supreme Court. Supporters of the move argued that this reform was a democratic correction, restoring balance to an unelected and out-of-touch judiciary that had grown too powerful. Opponents saw it as the demolition of the one branch of government capable of checking executive authority. Scholars like Ruth Gaveston and Shlomo Avineri had been warning for years that Israel's ambiguous separation of powers and lack of a constitution was a ticking time bomb. Others warned that in an increasingly fragmented society, Israelis were living in entirely different realities. But they still had the appetite for a fight. Within weeks, hundreds of thousands of Israelis had massed in the streets, carrying signs that read, "Save democracy," and "We love the country, we fear the government." The Israeli flag became a symbol not of the government, but of the opposition. This was Zionism in full force, arrayed against a government that claimed to represent Israel's interests. Tech executives staged code strikes. Air Force reservists formed human chains outside the Knesset, threatening not to show up to reserve duty. Protesters closed roads and snarled traffic. Every week, more and more people showed up. In response, coalition supporters staged their own rallies, accusing the protesters of elitism and judicial tyranny. Both sides claimed to be saving Zionism from the other. Micha Gutman, the philosopher I mentioned before, who somehow manages to be everyone's favorite moderate, captured the divide perfectly, writing, quote, "The right fears that Israel's losing its Jewish identity. The left fears that Israel's losing its democratic soul." By mid-2023, pundits began to speak of civil war. And across the country, citizens repeated the same exhausted refrain. Ze lo yachol yamashech kach, or ze lo yachol lehamshich kach, whichever one is correct. This can't go on. The fight encompassed more than just judicial reforms. Everything was up for grabs, as old status quos were shaken loose and interrogated angrily. Back in 1948, Ben-Gurion had granted a draft exemption to a few hundred ultra-Orthodox yeshiva students, hoping to preserve the, quote, remnants of Torah destroyed in the Holocaust and to secure Haredi support for the Zionist endeavor of the creation of a Jewish state. He figured it was a small price to pay. It was, in 1948. but by the 2020s, it was punishing. The number of draft-exempt Haredi men had swelled to the tens of thousands. Entire neighborhoods of Bnei Brak and Jerusalem lived off state stipends so they could study Torah full-time. The demographics told their own story. Though Haredi made up roughly 13% of Israel's population, their children made up nearly a quarter of all school-age Israelis, a share projected to double within a generation. And non-Haredi Israelis who sacrificed their sons and their daughters in combat, whose taxes supported Haredi families, they were sick of it. Holding signs that read, "One people, one army," they remained completely unmoved by the Haredi argument that Torah study was a form of national service, that Israel's spiritual protection depended on those who studied God's word. Politician, intellectual provocateur, and former guest of the pod, Einat Wilf, once called the draft exemption the original sin of Israeli democracy. Not because it was malicious, but because it institutionalized a double standard of duty. The promise of Zionism, she wrote, was shared responsibility for a shared homeland. The exemption turned that promise into a privilege. But this wasn't just about fairness. It was about vision too. For the Haredi world, modern Zionism itself remained suspect, a rebellion against divine timing. To embrace the state fully would mean accepting a secular sovereignty that, in their eyes, preempted divine redemption. And yet, hundreds of thousands of Haredim relied on the tax shekels of passionate Zionists to sustain their lifestyle. It's the ultimate Zionist paradox. The movement that ended Jewish dependency in exile created new dependencies at home. The fault lines weren't always clean, of course. Many Haredim quietly worked, contributing to the economy, if not to the army. Many secular Israelis revered God, Torah, synagogue, even if they only visited once a year. But that wasn't enough to unify the opposing sides. The old resentments had burst open, demanding resolution. For a moment, it seemed that Zionism itself was unraveling, that the narrative that had sustained the Jewish people no longer made sense, that the great experiment of the Jewish state had become untenable, impossible, too riven with contradictions and competing visions of the future. And then the clock struck 6:29 on the morning of October 7th, and the fault lines disappeared. Chapter 5, Awakening. It was the holiday of Simchat Torah, the festive culmination of the Jewish holiday season. As the sirens wailed and the rockets rained down, as shaky footage made its way through Israeli social media, joy gave way to horror. A country convinced of its own deterrence watched its borders breached with terrifying ease. A state that prided itself on technological and intelligence supremacy discovered that even the sharpest systems can go blind. The most formidable army in the region found itself scrambling to respond to thousands of Gazans on paragliders and motorcycles. The military response in Gaza, overwhelming, painful, relentless, became a national reckoning. And when the mass call-up of reservists came, it swept in the whole country at once. Religious Zionists and secular Tel Avivians, immigrants from Moscow and Sabras from Sderot, people who had marched for judicial reform and people who had marched against the, quote, judicial coup, all serving in the same tanks, the same convoy, in the same ambulances. Back home, Haredi draft activists and yeshiva students, tech executives and Arab citizens, the elderly and the very young, crouched together in bomb shelters, each profoundly aware that nothing separated them from the 1,200 people murdered or the 251 taken hostage in one horrible day. And then came the civilian response that surprised even hardened cynics, maybe even people like me. Everyone showed up in uniform, in reserves, in field kitchens, in supply hubs, in funerals. School teachers spent their days picking tomatoes in abandoned fields. Engineers stood over industrial pots cooking meals for infantry brigades. Teens who had barely learned to drive were shuttling desperately needed supplies up and down the country. A line of Haredi men snaked around the corner at the local enlistment bureau. Druze women hastily converted their kitchens so they could cook kosher food for soldiers. Bedouin soldiers posted Arabic language videos to social media promising Hamas a bloody revenge. Waves of volunteers poured in from abroad. Young professionals, retirees, rabbinical students, Jews and Christians from Toronto and Melbourne and Johannesburg arrived to sort donations, pack meals, and write checks from communities that felt the pain from thousands of miles away. Trumpeldor was long gone by now, but for a moment his echo reverberated all over the world. I am a wheel, take me. Simultaneously, diaspora Jews confronted something most had only read about: the daily sting of anti-Semitism. College students found themselves excluded and harassed. Masked protesters commandeered the subway, demanding that the, quote, Zionists raise their hands. How dare they? Swastikas appeared with alarming regularity. And as the death toll rose in both Israel and Gaza, diaspora Jews found themselves targeted too. A firebombing in Colorado, an arson in Philadelphia, a murder in LA, a shooting in DC, a massacre at a Hanukkah party in Bondi, Australia. Countless acts of vandalism and property damage. Journalists wrote grim headlines, unimaginable only a year before. The holiday from history is over. For the first time in 2,000 years, the center of gravity of the Jewish people is shifting decisively. Within a decade or two, the majority of the world's Jews will likely live in Israel. A project born in the diaspora is now entering an age when there may be no significant diaspora at all. So what does Zionism become now? What happens to an ideology of return once everyone comes home? Zionism was once a sanctuary, then a destination, then an accomplishment. But the story of Zionism is far from over. Zionism did not end in 1948. Today, Zionism is something harder, a daily discipline of wielding Jewish power without losing Jewish purpose. And as Israel's demographics shift, with fast-growing Haredi communities, a large and politically active Arab minority, and a secular public pulled between tradition and modernity, how will these identities coexist inside a democracy that wants to be unmistakably Jewish and confidently modern at the same time? There are more questions than answers, and I'll be the first to tell you that I don't know. But what I do know is this. I don't think it's a coincidence that October 7th, which I view as the most important day in modern Jewish history, fell on Simchat Torah, because this holiday celebrates the completion of the Torah. When we read the final chapter of the book we've read all year, it should feel like closure, like the end. But of course it isn't, because at that very moment, at the height of celebration, something unusual happens. We don't close the scroll and walk away satisfied. We open it again, to the very beginning, the first words ever written about our story. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And to me, there is no better metaphor for Zionism, for Judaism in general. The closing words are not closure at all, but an invitation to begin again, to read the same story with new responsibilities, new questions, new eyes. And so we end this season with the ancient ritual that has carried us through every generation. Back to Bereshit, back to the beginning. Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor, v'lo ata ben chorin libatel mimena. That's what we say in Pirkei Avot in the Mishnah. It is not our job to finish the work, and we're also not free to neglect it. This is my work, telling and retelling the Jewish story. Questioning it where I feel compelled to, loving it where I can, struggling with it because that's what it means to be a child of Israel. In Hebrew, Genesis 32:29. Vayomer lo Yaakov ye'amer od shimcha ki im Yisrael. Why? Ki sarita im Elohim ve'im anashim vatuchal. Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with beings divine and human and have prevailed. Sarita, striven, toiled, struggled. We named our own daughter that, Sarit, after this verse. We've spent the past 5 weeks tracing a struggle that began the moment Avraham saddled his camels and headed for Canaan. But God never promised the journey would be easy, only that it would result in greatness, that it would transform the world. To be a Jew is to wrestle with history, and vatuchal, to overcome, to win. There is no logical reason for us, the Jewish people, to still exist. If you're not Jewish and listening, and we have millions of you out there, you know this. We know this. We survived Babylon and Rome, exile and expulsion, crusades and pogroms and inquisitions, blood libels and genocide, and to have returned again and again to the place where we learned to be a nation, to the land that shares our name. No reason that is except for a story. This story, the one that we just spent 5 weeks exploring, this is the story that has sustained us. A 4,000-year-old epic, still going strong. The reason I said I like that line earlier from Hanan Parat is because if you actually feel like you're part of Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, that you're part of the story, you're going to take it very seriously. You're going to want to write that next chapter. You're going to want to see yourself as part of it. So this may be the final episode of this series, but it's not an ending. It's an invitation to learn more, to question, to struggle, to find your place, to write your place, no matter how humble in the grand arc of history, because that's it, by the way. That's the secret to Jewish immortality, to the unlikely survival of a stiff-necked, squabbling desert tribe, the telling and retelling of our story throughout the long days and cold nights of exile and despair. That's it, and that's everything. Unpacking Israeli History is a production of Unpacked, an OpenDor Media brand. Follow us wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a rating on Apple or Spotify. It really does help other people find the show. And one more time, I love hearing from you, so email me at noam@unpacked.media. This episode was produced by Rifki Stern. Our team for this episode includes Amir Tzamach, Adi Albaz, Rob Pera, and Lior Lowe. I'm your host, Noam Weissman. Thanks for being here for this entire epic saga, and I hope you enjoyed it. It was a real labor of love. I love my team. My team is the best, the absolute best. See you next week.